Hey everybody, it's Ben with the DIY Homefront, and today we're going to take care of some damaged wood. It's by the gate in the back of the property, so let's get into it. So this is the gate that we have on the back side of our property, and it has been damaged by carpenter bees and the woodpeckers that have destroyed the wood trying to get to them. Most of the wood that needs to be replaced is the wood that supports the fence posts that are on each side of the gate. The latch for the gate needs to be adjusted. It just barely latches when you close it. And you can see these other pieces of wood that have damage from the carpenter bees and the woodpeckers. When I make repairs, I like to take a permanent marker and number the pieces of wood that I need to replace. I might even make notes on it, like I need to have more wood at this particular spot. I also like to number the pieces of wood in the order that I plan on removing them and replacing them, so it makes a lot of sense. 1 and 2 are on one side of the gate, and boards 3 and 4 will be on the other side of the gate. And if I see something that I need to adjust, like I think this board might need to be longer, I'll write that on the wood too. I stopped using nails a long time ago and prefer to use screws. If I make an error or a mistake, I can just take the screws out and use the wood someplace else. Also, when you need to make repairs, it's a lot easier with screws taking things apart. I have a couple of magnetized trays, and I like to put my metal screws in those trays. It just makes it easier to keep track of them, and I don't have to worry about dropping any on the ground. This is an older Torx bit I'm using, so if I have a screw that doesn't want to come out, I'm just going to leave it and I'll come back to it with a better bit. Well, I'm just going to keep taking out these screws, and we'll speed stuff up a little bit until I'm done. I save a lot of my wood. A lot of times, even with these fence posts, they'll rot right where they meet the ground, but the rest of it will be just fine. And I hang on to all that wood and try to recycle as much as I can. So that means if I need some kind of wooden support or piece to a project that's less than 4.5 feet, I've got it on my scrap pile. Well, here I come with the lawnmower, and in the cart are all the pieces of wood we took off and some scrap 4x4 posts that we might be able to use to recreate some. I've got the other end of this extension cord ran to the barn, and we'll plug up this compound miter saw. This is the first board we need to cut, and it needs to be just a little bit longer than what it is right now. Here's our first scrap 4x4 post, and I'll give it a quick look over to make sure the wood's still in good condition. After I've decided the condition of the wood, I usually go back and just double check to make sure that it's going to be long enough. And then if there's a portion that needs to be trimmed off, like the top has some deep splits, I will go ahead and cut that off. I have no idea why, but it always seems like the top foot of a post is in rough shape. And after cutting the top of this post off, like I said, the wood's in really good shape. So you flip the wood over to cut the other end, and then I'll take the piece that I'm trying to match, put it on the wood, and use it like a measuring tape. And just like my notes said, I'll put a mark on it, but I'll make it just a little bit longer. And with the mark there, I can go ahead and cut the piece of wood. And the last thing to do is to take that permanent marker and mark the wood that you cut. So that way you know what piece of wood it's replacing and where it goes on your project. Now let's take that piece of wood that we are replacing and cut it in half and see what those carpenter bees can do to a piece of wood. It's pretty amazing how destructive those carpenter bees can really be. So just like the last board, I will do the same thing. I will mark each individual piece. This board's a little bit long, So I'll go ahead and cut the end off into 2 pieces to make it easier to put in the fire. One thing I like about having my cart set up like this is I can take the scraps and just toss it right in the cart. And when the job is done, drive over to the fire and put all this on the fire. These 4x4 posts are pressure treated and have chemicals in them to help preserve them. So when I burn them when I'm not going to be around the fire. And now I'll put the piece I need on it. Make sure that it's all lined up, the ends are flush, and mark it to be cut. If you recycle wood, there's something else you need to do, and that's pay attention to the surface. This post had the fence stapled to it, so it's got holes all down one side. So I will mark this post and make sure that those holes are facing towards the bottom. And that'll make the board look better when it's on the fence, and it also is less places for water to be able to penetrate the board and damage it in the future. Most of the time I will go back and give a light sanding to all the boards that I'm reusing. It just makes them look so much better. And this is the side that had all the staples in it for the fence. And when it's all done, it's a good looking piece of wood that saved me some money. I'm not a contractor, but I use my tools like I'm one. And I was working on my next piece of wood and the sander just fell apart. The pad came off. It's still moving, isn't it? Well, I'll just unplug this one and go get another sander. And we'll put this one on the list of items that need to be fixed. Well, that'll finish up this one. Now let's look at one of those pieces we needed that had some angles to it. Just like before, I'll check out this 4x4 post to see how it looks. And it had some of it that was buried in the ground that I thought I was going to end up needing to use. So I thought I better sand it down to make sure it was structurally sound. We put the old board on top of it and make sure it's all lined up. And then we mark one end. And then the other end. And because these cuts are at an angle, we'll have to adjust the miter saw. It takes a little more effort for the saw to cut through the wood at a 45-degree angle, and it's a little bit more difficult to hold also. We cut the second 45-degree angle paying attention to our little more note. This is our last board, and in this clip, it's a lot easier to see how I line up the last angled cut. Well, this is the fire I have going, and I'm going to load up some of these scraps onto this fire before I head back to the fence to put on the new boards. I'll use my sledgehammer to tap any screws that might have sheared off because of rust, just to make sure they're flush with the post. And we'll pay attention to the marks put on the wood and put the first piece where the first piece goes, right next to the gate. After watching some other YouTubers, I decided that it might be better to put this brace a little bit lower at about 36 inches. That way it shouldn't lift any wood up out of the ground when you tighten up the fence. I use a level, but sometimes I don't know if it makes much difference. As Puddin would say, sometimes you just gotta eagle eye it. When I recycle the wood, it's normally awfully dry. So I always drill pilot holes before I put any screws in it, because I have found the screws just split the wood after a year or two. And I will either use 3.5 inch or 4 inch deck screws for this. Over the years, I have really learned to appreciate these impact drivers. They make putting deck screws, construction screws, and lag bolts in extremely easy. Should be easier to get the board level now that we have one side anchored to the post. And this is how I drill my pilot holes. I normally will put a divot in the wood to get the drill bit started, and then I can use that and push the drill bit in and turn it sort of at the same time. Well, these screws are a little bit shorter than the ones I would prefer to use, but I ran out of those, and to go to town and back takes about an hour and 15 minutes, and I would rather just keep working than spend that time driving. So now I'm going to figure out the distance between the top of my support post and the top of the gate. And I'll go to the other side of the gate and transfer that mark. And the other side gets done the same way, pilot holes, deck screws. But the reason why I used the top of the gate as my measuring point was because I wanted both sides to mirror each other. And the only way to do that was using the top of the gate as a reference. And after that, it's on to adjusting the latch for the gate. And I'll start by removing all the screws that holds the latch in place. There's a piece of 2x4 that's used as a spacer to make sure the metal portion on the post and the metal part of the latch line up. I will end up using the drill and drilling a pilot hole through that. Once the impact driver has tightened up the screw and the latch is held in place, I can go ahead and drill the other holes. I'll make sure I use long screws so that I go all the way through the 2x4 I'm using as a spacer. The diameter of the drill bit I'm using is probably just a little bit bigger than the diameter of the deck screws I'm using. And the 4 deck screws should be more than enough to hold it permanently in place. We'll give the latch mechanism a good jiggle and make sure it works like it's supposed to, and this problem is fixed. Well, I changed the design of the fence and lowered the top beam, which means those pieces that I had spent all that time cutting before will not fit. So I'm going to remark these support braces, get the saw back out, and get them cut. And this might mean redoing some of my work, but I feel like it's probably a better way to support the fence and the gate. Make sure you're careful on how you hold the wood when you're using a miter saw. You want to cut the wood, not your foot or your arm. I want everybody to finish their projects without any injuries. The support braces will be held in place with construction bolts, and I'll go ahead and get the holes drilled out and the construction bolts started before I take them up and attach them to the post. This is one of those places where you really need an impact driver over a drill to get these construction bolts secured. And I pre-drilled and started the 2 screws basically because these 2 bottom ones would have been too difficult any other way. It's not a very sunny day, but here's the finished product. The gate closes well, and you can see the wood that we replaced. And here you can tell how we lowered that top beam by about a foot. Well, there you go. One small project on my fence is taken care of. We got the latch on the gate fixed, and we replaced some wood that was eaten up with carpenter bees and woodpeckers. Well, that concludes this particular episode. I'm sure we've got plenty more to come. I've got a large piece of property and a lot of fence. Until then, like, subscribe, check out the playlist, and I'll see you in that next video.